Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe, the place where we explore important global topics while helping you improve your English through thoughtful conversations and real-world discussions. And today, we are going to talk about a topic that sits at the center of global trade, energy security, and international politics. Because in today's episode, we are exploring a very important question that many people around the world are asking right now. Why are Chinese ships still passing through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow but incredibly strategic waterway that has become one of the most closely watched locations on the planet, whenever tensions rise in the Middle East?
This is a fascinating topic, Adam, because when people hear about global politics, they often think about large countries, powerful leaders, and international conflicts. But sometimes the most important stories in the world are connected to geography, especially small but extremely strategic locations that control major trade routes. And the Strait of Hormuz is exactly one of those places where geography, economics, and international politics meet in a very powerful way that affects not only the Middle East, but also Asia, Europe, and the entire global economy.
Before we go deeper into today's discussion, dear listeners, if you enjoy learning about global affairs, international economics, and world politics while improving your English listening skills, please take a moment to support our work by liking this video and subscribing to the English Globe, because your support helps this channel continue creating educational content for English learners around the world who want to understand the real events shaping our modern world.
And we would also love to hear from you, because our listeners come from many different countries and cultures. So please write in the comments and tell us where you are listening from today, whether you are in Asia, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, or anywhere else in the world. And also share your opinion about today's topic, because your thoughts and perspectives make this global learning community even more interesting and meaningful for everyone who joins our conversations.
Now let us begin by imagining something very interesting. Because when people think about the global oil industry, they often imagine huge oil fields, giant refineries, and powerful energy companies. But the truth is that much of the world's energy supply must travel through a very narrow waterway that connects the Persian Gulf to the wider oceans of the world. And that waterway is called the Strait of Hormuz, a passage that may look small on the map but carries an enormous amount of global importance.
The Strait of Hormuz is located between the coast of Iran on one side and the territory of Oman on the other side. And although the distance across the water at its narrowest point is only around 33 kilometers, this narrow corridor functions as one of the most critical gateways in the global energy system because millions of barrels of oil travel through it every single day on large tanker ships heading toward major energy markets in Asia, Europe, and other parts of the world.
Experts often describe the Strait of Hormuz as one of the world's most important strategic choke points, which is a term used in global trade and security discussions to describe narrow routes where a large amount of traffic must pass through a limited space. And in the case of the Strait of Hormuz, the numbers are truly remarkable, because nearly 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply travels through this single waterway, meaning that any disruption here can immediately affect global oil prices and energy markets across the planet.
This is why the Strait of Hormuz is constantly watched by governments, shipping companies, energy traders, and military forces, because even a small incident in this area can create global economic consequences, and history has shown many moments when tensions in the region caused concerns about whether ships would continue moving safely through this important corridor that connects the oil-producing countries of the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world.
Several major oil-exporting countries rely heavily on this route to send their energy supplies to international markets, including Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. And because these countries produce a large share of the oil used by modern economies, the smooth and secure operation of this shipping lane has become one of the most important priorities for global energy stability and international economic security.
However, in recent years, the Strait of Hormuz has also been associated with rising geopolitical tensions, naval patrols, and occasional security incidents that raise questions about the safety of shipping routes in the region. which makes the situation even more interesting when observers notice that ships from many countries continue to pass through the strait despite these concerns, including a significant number of tankers and cargo vessels connected to China.
And this is where today's topic becomes especially fascinating, because China is currently the largest importer of oil in the world, and its massive economy requires enormous amounts of energy to power factories, transportation systems, and growing cities, which means that Chinese shipping companies regularly send oil tankers and cargo ships through some of the most important maritime routes on Earth, including the Strait of Hormuz.
What makes this situation particularly interesting is that even during periods when tensions in the Middle East attract international attention and raise questions about maritime security, Chinese ships continue to appear frequently in shipping data and maritime tracking systems as they move through the Strait of Hormuz, carrying energy resources and trade goods that are essential for the Chinese economy and its vast industrial network.
For many observers, this raises an important and very intriguing question about global trade and strategic decision-making, because when a region experiences political tensions or security concerns, some countries and companies may try to avoid those areas. Yet in the case of China, the movement of ships through the Strait of Hormuz appears to continue as part of a larger pattern connected to global energy demand and long-established trade routes.
This situation leads us directly to the central question of today's episode, because understanding why Chinese ships continue traveling through this strategic but sometimes tense waterway requires us to explore several important factors, including geography, global energy demand, international shipping networks, and China's growing role in the global economy.
So as we continue our discussion in today's podcast, we will explore the geography of the Strait of Hormuz, the importance of Middle Eastern energy for the global economy, the reasons why China depends heavily on oil imports from this region, and the strategic choices that influence how shipping routes are used even during times of geopolitical uncertainty.
By the end of this conversation, dear listeners, you will have a clearer understanding of why this narrow waterway remains one of the most important energy gateways in the world, and why ships from many nations, including China, continue to pass through it as part of the complex and interconnected system that powers the modern global economy.
But the big question remains at the center of our discussion today, and it is a question that connects geography, economics, and international politics in a fascinating way.
Why does China continue using the Strait of Hormuz, even when geopolitical tensions in the region sometimes raise concerns about shipping security and global stability?
When we talk about the Strait of Hormuz, we are talking about a location that may appear small on a world map, but plays an enormous role in the global economy, because this narrow passage of water forms the only maritime gateway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, which then connects to the Arabian Sea and the wider Indian Ocean. And through this single route, the oil produced in several Middle Eastern countries travels toward major markets across Asia, Europe, and other regions, making the strait one of the most strategically important transportation corridors in the entire global energy system.
Geographically speaking, the Strait of Hormuz sits between the southern coast of Iran and the northern coast of Oman. And although the distance between the two sides of the strait is relatively narrow compared with many other international waterways, its location gives it extraordinary global importance because it functions as the only direct sea route for oil tankers leaving the Persian Gulf, meaning that ships carrying energy supplies must pass through this corridor before they can reach the open ocean and continue their long journeys towards some of the world's largest energy-consuming economies.
The Persian Gulf itself is one of the most energy-rich regions on Earth, containing several countries that produce massive quantities of oil every single day. And because many of these nations rely on maritime transportation to export their energy resources, the Strait of Hormuz has become the main export route through which this oil travels to international markets, meaning that energy consumed in cities thousands of kilometers away often begins its journey through this narrow but incredibly important waterway.
Among the countries that depend heavily on this shipping route is Saudi Arabia, one of the world's largest oil producers and exporters. Because although Saudi Arabia has developed certain pipelines that can transport oil across land, a significant portion of its energy exports still move through the Persian Gulf and into the Strait of Hormuz before reaching international customers, which means that the stability and security of this waterway remain extremely important for maintaining reliable global energy supplies.
Another major country connected to this route is Iraq, whose economy depends strongly on oil exports and whose production fields are located mainly in the southern part of the country near the Persian Gulf, which means that large oil tankers leaving Iraqi ports must travel through the Strait of Hormuz in order to reach global markets, making the uninterrupted operation of this maritime corridor a vital component of Iraq's economic relationship with the rest of the world.
The United Arab Emirates also plays an important role in this regional energy network because it produces large quantities of oil and natural gas that are exported to many countries around the globe. And although the UAE has invested in infrastructure designed to diversify its export routes, much of its maritime trade still passes through the Strait of Hormuz, which demonstrates how deeply connected the economies of the Gulf region are to this single strategic gateway.
Kuwait is another country whose economic stability is closely connected to the safe movement of ships through the strait. Because as a major oil exporter, Kuwait sends millions of barrels of crude oil to international markets every day, and those shipments must travel through the Persian Gulf and then pass through the Strait of Hormuz before continuing toward customers in Asia and other regions where demand for energy remains extremely high.
Qatar also relies heavily on this route, especially for exporting liquefied natural gas and other energy resources that are transported by specialized ships traveling from Gulf ports toward energy markets around the world, which means that the continued accessibility of the Strait of Hormuz is essential not only for oil trade, but also for the broader international energy system that supplies fuel and electricity to billions of people.
Iran itself is another important country connected to this waterway because it sits directly along the northern side of the strait and exports oil and other energy resources through the same maritime route used by its neighbors, which means that multiple national economies and large portions of global energy trade depend on the smooth operation of this narrow corridor that connects the Persian Gulf to the wider oceans of the world.
Because so many major energy producers rely on this route, the numbers associated with the Strait of Hormuz are truly remarkable, since analysts estimate that around 20% of the world's oil supply moves through this passage every single day, with approximately 17 to 20 million barrels of oil traveling on tankers through the strait as they head toward international markets where energy demand continues to grow alongside population and economic activity.
Despite its importance, ships cannot easily avoid this route because there are very limited alternatives capable of transporting the same massive volume of energy resources. Since pipelines that bypass the strait exist but have limited capacity and cannot fully replace the enormous flow of oil transported by large tanker ships, which means that maritime transportation through this narrow passage remains the most efficient and widely used method for moving Gulf energy supplies to global markets.
For this reason, the Strait of Hormuz is often described by analysts and policymakers as a strategic choke point in the global energy system, because such a large amount of trade must pass through a relatively small geographic area that can be closely monitored by regional governments and international naval forces, which explains why major world powers pay careful attention to developments in this region as they seek to ensure that one of the most important shipping routes on Earth remains open and stable.
When we begin to analyze why Chinese ships continue traveling through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important factors to understand is China's enormous demand for energy. Because over the past several decades, the country has experienced one of the fastest periods of industrial and economic expansion in modern history, transforming itself into the world's second-largest economy and the center of a vast global manufacturing network. And this rapid development requires an extraordinary amount of energy to power factories, transportation systems, construction projects, and growing urban populations.
I completely agree with that perspective, Adam, because when economists study the global energy market, they often point to China as the most important driver of oil demand growth during the last 20 years. And today, China is widely recognized as the largest importer of oil in the world, which means that the country relies heavily on international energy supplies in order to sustain its economic momentum and maintain the production levels that support both domestic consumption and global trade.
Exactly, Julia. And this situation exists because China's domestic oil production cannot fully meet the needs of its massive economy, which means that the country must import millions of barrels of crude oil every single day from foreign suppliers in order to keep its industries operating smoothly and ensure that transportation networks, power generation systems, and manufacturing facilities continue functioning without interruption.
And when we look at China's industrial structure, the importance of these energy imports becomes even clearer, because the country's manufacturing sector produces everything from electronics and machinery to vehicles, construction materials, and consumer goods. And all of these industries depend heavily on stable and affordable energy supplies to maintain production levels that serve both the Chinese domestic market and customers around the world.
That is absolutely correct. And when we analyze the sources of China's oil imports, we see that a large portion of those supplies comes from the Middle East, where several major oil-producing countries maintain strong trade relationships with China and regularly export significant volumes of crude oil that travel through the Persian Gulf and pass directly through the Strait of Hormuz before continuing toward Asian energy markets.
One of the most important suppliers in this relationship is Saudi Arabia, which has long been one of China's largest energy partners, providing substantial quantities of crude oil that help support China's industrial system. And this partnership reflects not only economic cooperation, but also the broader importance of stable energy trade between major producers in the Middle East and major consumers in Asia.
In addition to Saudi Arabia, China also imports oil from Iran, whose energy resources have played a significant role in regional energy markets for many years. And although international political dynamics can sometimes influence trade relationships, energy cooperation between producers and consumers often continues because both sides benefit from maintaining reliable supply and demand connections within the global energy system.
Another major supplier connected to China's energy network is Iraq, which has significantly increased its oil production in recent years and exports large quantities of crude oil to international markets, including shipments that travel toward China, demonstrating how the country's growing industrial demand has encouraged stronger energy trade ties with several important oil-producing nations in the Middle East.
The United Arab Emirates also plays a notable role in this system because it produces and exports large volumes of oil that contribute to the stability of global energy markets. And Chinese companies and refineries regularly receive shipments originating from Gulf ports, showing how the region has become a central pillar of China's broader strategy for securing long-term access to reliable energy resources.
Kuwait is another country whose energy exports support China's expanding economy, because Kuwaiti oil shipments travel through the same maritime routes used by other Gulf producers, reinforcing the importance of stable transportation corridors like the Strait of Hormuz that connect Middle Eastern energy resources with the rapidly growing economies of Asia.
When we consider all of these relationships together, it becomes clear that China's energy supply network depends heavily on oil produced in the Middle East and transported through maritime routes that pass directly through the Strait of Hormuz, which means that the stability of this region is closely linked to China's ability to maintain consistent industrial output and economic growth.
I agree with that conclusion, because China's transportation sector alone consumes enormous quantities of fuel every day, as millions of vehicles, commercial trucks, cargo ships, and airplanes operate across the country's vast territory. And as the population continues to grow and urbanization expands, the demand for transportation energy increases as well.
This growing demand explains why energy security has become a major strategic priority for policymakers in Beijing, since ensuring a reliable supply of oil is essential for protecting economic stability, maintaining industrial productivity, and supporting the long-term development plans that guide China's national economic strategy.
And when we look at the global energy landscape realistically, it becomes clear that China cannot easily replace Middle Eastern oil supplies in the short term, because the region contains some of the largest and most accessible oil reserves in the world, which means that for the foreseeable future, China will likely remain deeply connected to the energy routes that pass through the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz.
When we expand our discussion beyond energy demand and begin looking at China's broader trade system, we start to see that the Strait of Hormuz is not just an isolated shipping route, but a crucial link inside a vast maritime network that connects Asia with the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. Because China's economy depends heavily on international trade and global transportation corridors, and enormous fleets of cargo vessels regularly travel across the Indian Ocean, through the Arabian Sea, and into different regions of the world, carrying everything from manufactured goods to raw materials that sustain modern industrial economies.
That is an important point, Adam, because when we study global trade flows, it becomes clear that China sits at the center of an immense maritime transportation system, with container ships leaving Chinese ports every day and heading toward destinations across the globe. And at the same time, many ships travel in the opposite direction, bringing oil, minerals, agricultural products, and other resources back toward Chinese ports, which means that maintaining stable and efficient shipping routes has become one of the most important priorities for China's long-term economic planning.
Exactly, Julia. And this is why Chinese trade routes stretch across several major oceans and strategic waterways, linking East Asia with the Persian Gulf, the eastern coast of Africa, and the ports of the Mediterranean Sea, forming a continuous chain of maritime connections that allow goods to travel thousands of kilometers through some of the busiest shipping lanes on the planet. And many of these routes pass through narrow geographic passages such as the Strait of Hormuz that function as gateways connecting one major region of global commerce to another.
This larger vision of global connectivity is also closely related to an important policy initiative introduced by China that has received significant international attention over the past decade, known as the Belt and Road Initiative, which is often described as a long-term strategy designed to strengthen economic connections between Asia, Europe, Africa, and other regions through a combination of infrastructure investment, transportation development, and expanded trade partnerships.
The Belt and Road Initiative, sometimes called the BRI, represents one of the most ambitious international economic development projects in modern history because it seeks to improve both land-based and sea-based trade corridors that allow goods, energy resources, and investments to move more efficiently between continents. And the maritime component of this initiative is especially important because the majority of global trade continues to travel by sea.
Within this initiative, the concept of the Maritime Silk Road plays a particularly significant role because it focuses specifically on strengthening shipping routes that connect Chinese ports with Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, East Africa, and eventually Europe, creating a modern version of ancient trading networks that historically linked civilizations through the movement of goods, knowledge, and cultural exchange across oceans and coastal regions.
An essential part of this maritime strategy involves the expansion and modernization of port infrastructure around the world. And Chinese companies have invested in or cooperated with port authorities in several countries in order to improve logistics capacity, cargo handling facilities, and transportation efficiency, which helps create a smoother flow of goods moving between continents and strengthens the reliability of long-distance maritime supply chains.
One example frequently discussed in this context is the port of Gwadar in Pakistan, which sits along the Arabian Sea and occupies a geographically important location near the entrance to the Persian Gulf region, making it an interesting point within the broader network of maritime trade routes that connect energy-producing regions with the manufacturing centers and consumer markets of Asia.
Another strategically important location is Djibouti, a small but highly significant country located at the entrance to the Red Sea, where ships pass on their way toward the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean Sea. And the development of port infrastructure in this region helps strengthen connections between Asian shipping routes and the major trade corridors linking Africa and Europe.
A third example often mentioned in discussions about global shipping networks is the port of Piraeus in Greece, which serves as an important entry point for goods traveling from Asia into Europe. And improvements in port efficiency, they have helped accelerate the movement of cargo containers arriving from long maritime journeys that begin in East Asia and pass through multiple strategic waterways along the route.
When we observe these examples together, we can see that China's maritime strategy involves creating a chain of interconnected shipping hubs and logistical gateways that allow trade to move smoothly between distant regions. And this global network depends heavily on the reliability of key maritime passages that ships must cross as they travel between continents.
Among these passages, the Strait of Hormuz occupies a particularly crucial position because it connects the Persian Gulf, where many energy resources originate, with the wider shipping routes of the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, meaning that a large portion of the oil and energy supplies destined for Asian markets must pass through this narrow corridor before continuing toward major ports across the region.
For China specifically, the strait functions as a critical gateway within its broader maritime trade system, because energy resources traveling from Middle Eastern suppliers must move through this waterway before reaching the shipping lanes that lead toward Chinese refineries, industrial centers, and commercial ports that support the country's economic growth.
And this is why analysts often emphasize that the Strait of Hormuz is not simply a regional shipping route, but a key component of a much larger global network connecting energy production zones, manufacturing economies, and international consumer markets, which explains why so many countries and shipping companies continue to monitor developments in this region with great attention and interest. As we continue exploring the importance of the Strait of Hormuz, it is also necessary to discuss the security challenges that sometimes arise in this region, because this narrow waterway sits in an area where international politics, regional rivalries, and global economic interests intersect. And over the years, tensions between different countries have occasionally raised concerns about the safety of commercial shipping, which is why governments, energy companies, and maritime organizations pay extremely close attention to developments in this strategically important corridor.
That is a very important point, Julia, because when analysts discuss global energy security, they often highlight the Strait of Hormuz as one of the most sensitive locations in the world, not only because of the enormous volume of oil that travels through it every day, but also because any disruption in this passage could quickly influence international markets, energy prices, and the stability of supply chains that depend on predictable and reliable transportation routes.
One of the major sources of geopolitical tension in this region has historically involved the complex relationship between Iran and several Western countries, where political disagreements, diplomatic disputes, and broader strategic concerns have sometimes created periods of uncertainty in the wider Gulf region. And because Iran's coastline lies directly along the northern side of the Strait of Hormuz, developments related to these tensions naturally attract attention from observers who are monitoring maritime activity and regional security conditions.
Exactly, and because the Strait of Hormuz is such an important gateway for international trade, several major powers maintain a naval presence in nearby waters to monitor shipping lanes and ensure that commercial vessels can continue operating safely. And among these forces, the United States Navy has historically played a prominent role in conducting patrols and maintaining maritime awareness throughout the Gulf region.
The presence of naval forces in the region reflects the international importance of the strait, because many countries depend on the uninterrupted flow of oil and energy supplies that pass through this corridor, and governments recognize that protecting shipping routes helps prevent disruptions that could affect global markets and economic stability far beyond the Middle East itself.
In addition to national naval forces, there have also been international efforts to coordinate maritime security operations in the region, with several countries participating in cooperative initiatives designed to monitor shipping activity, share information about potential risks, and ensure that vessels traveling through the strait can navigate safely along the designated maritime channels used by commercial traffic.
Occasionally, news reports have mentioned incidents involving oil tankers or commercial ships in the broader Gulf region, which sometimes include disputes, inspections, or security concerns that attract global media attention. And although such events can create temporary uncertainty in international markets, shipping companies and maritime authorities usually work quickly to manage these situations and maintain the continued movement of vessels through the area.
Because the global economy depends so heavily on energy supplies traveling through this route, the international community places strong emphasis on maintaining freedom of navigation and ensuring that the Strait of Hormuz remains open to commercial traffic, since any prolonged disruption could affect not only oil exporters and importers, but also industries, transportation networks, and consumers around the world.
Energy security is therefore one of the central concerns connected to the Strait of Hormuz, because modern economies rely heavily on stable and predictable energy supplies. And when analysts evaluate global risks, they often examine whether key maritime routes like this one are operating normally, as even small interruptions in supply chains can influence fuel prices, production costs, and economic planning in many different countries.
Shipping companies that operate in this region are also very aware of these geopolitical dynamics, which is why they carefully monitor security conditions, communicate with maritime authorities, and follow internationally recognized navigation routes designed to minimize risks and ensure that vessels travel safely through the narrow channels that guide ships entering and leaving the Persian Gulf.
Despite the challenges that sometimes emerge in this environment, it is important to remember that global shipping networks are highly resilient and experienced in managing complex operating conditions, because maritime trade has always required cooperation between governments, shipping companies, and international organizations in order to maintain the smooth movement of goods across oceans and through strategically important waterways.
In fact, the continued presence of naval patrols, international monitoring systems, and coordinated maritime communication networks helps create a framework that supports safe navigation, allowing thousands of commercial vessels each year to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, while delivering energy resources and other cargo to markets around the world.
This combination of economic necessity and international cooperation explains why the strait continues to function as a vital artery of global commerce, even during periods when political tensions capture headlines, because the shared interest in maintaining stable energy supplies encourages countries and institutions to support efforts that keep the shipping lanes open.
So even though the Strait of Hormuz is sometimes described as a region where geopolitical tensions and security concerns can appear, the reality is that global trade continues moving through this corridor every day, demonstrating how deeply interconnected the world economy has become and how strongly countries depend on maintaining reliable access to critical maritime routes that sustain the flow of energy and commerce across the planet. Now that we have explored the geography of the Strait of Hormuz, the global energy system connected to it, and the security challenges sometimes associated with the region, we can finally turn our attention directly to the central question of today's discussion, which is why Chinese ships continue traveling through this narrow but strategically important waterway, even during periods when geopolitical tensions attract international attention. And the answer becomes clearer when we examine the realities of geography, global trade routes, and the structure of the modern energy economy.
I agree completely, Adam, because when people look at global news headlines, they may sometimes assume that shipping companies or entire countries can easily change their trade routes whenever tensions appear in a certain region. But in reality, international shipping networks are built around geography and infrastructure that cannot simply be replaced overnight, which means that certain routes remain essential regardless of political developments or temporary uncertainties.
The first and perhaps most fundamental reason Chinese ships continue using the Strait of Hormuz is geographic necessity, because this waterway represents the only direct maritime gateway connecting the Persian Gulf with the Arabian Sea and the broader Indian Ocean. And since the majority of oil exports from Gulf countries travel through this passage, ships transporting energy supplies to Asian markets must pass through this corridor before continuing toward destinations such as China, India, Japan, and other large energy-consuming economies.
Exactly, and when we look at the map, it becomes very clear why this route remains so important. Because the Persian Gulf is surrounded by major oil-producing countries that rely on maritime shipping to send their energy resources abroad, and the Strait of Hormuz sits at the entrance to that gulf, which means that nearly every tanker carrying oil from this region must navigate through this narrow channel before reaching the open ocean.
Another key reason involves the lack of efficient alternative routes capable of transporting the same enormous volume of oil that currently moves through the strait. Because although certain pipelines have been built to bypass the waterway, their capacity is limited and they cannot replace the millions of barrels of oil transported each day by large tanker ships traveling along established maritime routes.
That limitation is extremely important because global energy markets operate at a scale where even small disruptions or reductions in transportation capacity can create major economic consequences. And this means that shipping routes capable of carrying vast quantities of oil efficiently are incredibly valuable for both exporters and importers who depend on stable supply chains.
China's dependence on Middle Eastern oil is another major factor that explains why its ships continue to travel through the Strait of Hormuz. Because as we discussed earlier, China imports a large share of its energy from countries located in the Persian Gulf region, including Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Iran, which means that tankers carrying these supplies must pass through the strait before heading toward Asian ports.
And when we consider the scale of China's economy, it becomes clear that maintaining reliable energy supplies is absolutely essential for sustaining industrial production, transportation systems, and urban development across the country, which is why Chinese companies and policymakers carefully monitor global shipping routes and prioritize those that offer the most efficient and dependable connections to major energy-producing regions.
Economic efficiency also plays a crucial role in determining shipping routes. Because maritime transportation is generally the most cost-effective way to move large quantities of oil across long distances, and the established route from the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz and across the Indian Ocean has been used for decades as one of the most practical and efficient pathways connecting Middle Eastern producers with Asian consumers.
Another interesting factor is China's diplomatic approach to the Middle East, because unlike some countries that align strongly with one side of regional political disputes, China often maintains balanced diplomatic relationships with multiple nations across the region, including both Iran and several Gulf states that export large amounts of oil.
That balanced diplomatic posture allows China to maintain strong economic partnerships with a wide range of countries, which helps support stable trade relationships and reduces the likelihood that political disagreements might interrupt the flow of energy supplies or commercial shipping activities that are vital for economic cooperation.
It is also important to remember that China's trade with the Middle East extends far beyond oil imports alone, because Chinese companies export manufactured goods, technology products, construction equipment, and many other items to markets across the region, which means that maritime routes like the Strait of Hormuz also support a broader exchange of goods that strengthens economic connections between China and Middle Eastern countries.
All of these factors together help explain why Chinese ships continue to pass through the Strait of Hormuz as part of their regular trading patterns. Because geography, economic efficiency, energy demand, and international shipping infrastructure all combine to make this route one of the most practical pathways linking the energy resources of the Persian Gulf with the rapidly growing economies of Asia.
When we look at the situation from a broader perspective, it becomes clear that China's primary interest in the region is maintaining economic stability and uninterrupted trade, since stable supply chains help ensure predictable energy prices, reliable industrial production, and long-term economic planning that benefits both China and its trading partners.
So, although headlines may sometimes focus on geopolitical tensions in the region, the reality is that the global economy continues to rely heavily on established maritime routes like the Strait of Hormuz, and countries such as China continue using these pathways because they remain the most efficient, reliable, and geographically logical routes connecting major energy producers with the industries and populations that depend on their resources.
As we continue analyzing why Chinese ships keep moving through the Strait of Hormuz, it is essential to consider China's diplomatic strategy in the Middle East. Because maritime trade is not only about geography and logistics, it is also about relationships with the countries that control these strategic regions. And over the past decades, China has built strong and pragmatic relationships with many key powers in the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, which are all major energy exporters whose cooperation is critical for China's continued access to oil and other resources.
Absolutely, Julia. What makes China's approach particularly effective is that it positions itself as a neutral economic partner rather than a political or military actor seeking to dominate the region. For example, in 2023, China played a noticeable role in facilitating diplomatic dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran, two countries with long-standing regional rivalries. By promoting communication and reducing tensions between them, China helped create a more stable environment for trade and shipping, which directly benefits the movement of energy resources through strategic points like the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly, Adam. Unlike some Western powers that sometimes tie economic cooperation to military alliances or political conditions, China's relationships in the Middle East are largely economic and pragmatic. Beijing focuses on trade agreements, energy partnerships, and infrastructure investments that mutually benefit both sides, and this approach allows Chinese ships to operate in the region with a lower risk of being caught in political conflicts or sanctions, which ensures continuity in the supply chain.
Another important aspect of China's strategy is that it maintains balanced relations across the region. While China has strong ties with Saudi Arabia, it also engages closely with Iran, the UAE, and Qatar, which means it can navigate a highly complex geopolitical environment without taking sides in ways that would threaten its economic interests. By doing so, China ensures that its shipping lanes remain open and that commercial operations, especially oil imports, are not disrupted even during periods of heightened tension.
For example, China invests heavily in regional infrastructure projects, such as ports, refineries, and industrial zones, which strengthens its influence through economic channels rather than military presence. These investments provide incentives for local governments to maintain stable and cooperative relations with Beijing, which in turn indirectly safeguards China's shipping and energy supply routes, including those passing through critical choke points like the Strait of Hormuz.
It is also important to highlight that China avoids direct military involvement in the region. While some countries rely on naval patrols, military bases, and strategic deployments to secure their trade routes, China focuses on soft power, economic ties, and diplomatic engagement. Its strategy emphasizes stability and predictability for commerce rather than intervention, which aligns with Beijing's broader global policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other nations.
Yes, Adam. China's diplomatic engagement is often subtle but highly effective. By mediating disputes, facilitating dialogue, and building mutual trust with multiple Gulf countries, Beijing creates an environment where its economic activities, including shipping, are less vulnerable to disruptions caused by regional conflicts or sanctions. In essence, China's diplomacy works as a protective shield for its commercial interests, ensuring uninterrupted trade.
For instance, the 2023 dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran demonstrates how China can leverage its neutral stance to promote peace and stability in areas that directly affect its economic security. By encouraging both nations to communicate and reduce tensions, China indirectly protects the maritime routes that its tankers rely on, showing that diplomatic skill can be just as critical as geographical access in maintaining reliable shipping networks.
Furthermore, China's engagement is long-term and strategic rather than reactive. Beijing invests in infrastructure, energy projects, and trade partnerships with a horizon of decades, meaning that it has a vested interest in preserving the stability of the region over the long term. This commitment reassures its trading partners and strengthens the predictability of supply chains through the Gulf, benefiting Chinese shipping operations.
Another critical aspect is China's approach to energy diversification. While it imports oil from multiple Middle Eastern countries, it also ensures that its portfolio is spread across different nations. This diversified strategy reduces the risk of supply disruption from any single country, while encouraging China to maintain neutral and positive relations with all key players in the region, further supporting the safe passage of its ships through the Strait of Hormuz.
China's economic diplomacy is not limited to energy. Its broader trade partnerships, infrastructure development, and investment programs all contribute to stronger bilateral relations that reinforce stability. In essence, Beijing's consistent focus on economic incentives rather than political or military pressure creates a framework in which shipping routes remain secure and commerce can continue uninterrupted.
So, to summarize, China's diplomatic strategy in the Middle East works hand in hand with its maritime trade objectives. By fostering relationships with Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, and Qatar, maintaining a neutral stance, and leveraging economic influence rather than military force, China ensures that its ships can continue passing safely through the Strait of Hormuz, which is critical for sustaining its energy supply and global trade networks.
In other words, China relies on diplomacy as a key instrument for protecting its shipping interests. Because stable relations, mutual trust, and cooperative agreements reduce the likelihood of interruptions in maritime trade, demonstrating that economic engagement can sometimes be more powerful than military presence when it comes to securing global supply chains.
Exactly, Julia. Through careful and strategic diplomacy, China has managed to create an environment in which it can continue importing energy and conducting trade without resorting to military interventions, allowing its ships to navigate the Strait of Hormuz and other critical routes with confidence, ultimately securing the lifeline of its growing economy. As we continue our exploration of why Chinese ships continue to navigate the Strait of Hormuz, it is natural to ask whether there are viable alternatives for transporting oil and other energy resources from the Persian Gulf to China and other Asian markets, because the strait, while critical, is also a narrow and sometimes volatile corridor. In response to this challenge, analysts and policymakers have studied several potential alternatives, including pipelines and land-based routes that could theoretically bypass the strait. For example, Saudi Arabia has developed the East-West Pipeline, also known as the Petroline, which runs from the oil-rich eastern province near the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea port of Yanbu on the west coast of the country, allowing tankers to load oil without passing through the Strait of Hormuz.
That is true, Adam, but it is important to understand that while the Saudi East-West Pipeline provides a potential alternative, it has limitations that prevent it from fully replacing maritime shipments through the strait. The pipeline has a maximum capacity of several million barrels per day, which is significant but still only a portion of the total volume that moves through Hormuz daily. Moreover, transporting oil overland requires additional infrastructure, operational costs, and logistical coordination that make it less economically efficient than the established maritime route, particularly for shipments destined for distant Asian markets like China.
Similarly, the United Arab Emirates has invested in pipelines designed to bypass the strait, such as the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, which transports oil from inland production fields to the Gulf of Oman. This pipeline was built to provide an alternative export route in case the Strait of Hormuz became temporarily inaccessible due to political or security incidents. While the pipeline enhances regional resilience, it still cannot accommodate the full volume of tankers that normally pass through the strait, meaning that maritime shipping remains the dominant route for energy exports from the Gulf.
In addition to these pipelines, some analysts have considered overland routes through Central Asia, which could theoretically carry oil and gas northward through countries like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and eventually connect to China via existing pipeline infrastructure. While this approach may provide an alternative for diversifying supply routes, it also faces significant challenges, including limited capacity, geopolitical complications, and the need for extensive infrastructure investments to make the route viable for large-scale energy transportation.
Another factor to consider is that pipelines, while theoretically safer from maritime threats, are fixed and inflexible compared to shipping, meaning they cannot quickly adjust to changes in demand or redirect energy flows to different markets. Tankers, by contrast, can be rerouted relatively easily, allowing energy companies to respond to shifts in global markets, seasonal demand, or sudden disruptions elsewhere. This flexibility reinforces the importance of maritime routes, particularly the Strait of Hormuz, as the backbone of energy transportation from the Middle East to Asia.
Infrastructure limitations also present a major obstacle for alternative routes. Even existing pipelines have restrictions on maintenance, throughput, and connectivity with ports capable of handling supertankers. For example, the Saudi East-West pipeline ends at a Red Sea port, requiring additional shipping to move oil across the Indian Ocean, which adds cost and complexity compared to the direct maritime route through Hormuz. Similarly, overland routes through Central Asia must contend with terrain, climate, and political agreements with multiple countries, all of which increase the operational complexity and cost of these alternatives.
Transportation costs are another key consideration. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz is not only geographically direct, but also economically efficient. Tankers can carry millions of barrels of oil with relatively low fuel and operational costs per barrel, while pipelines require constant maintenance, pumping stations, and insurance against technical failures or geopolitical risks along the route. Overland routes multiply these costs even further, making Hormuz by far the most cost-effective option for the large volume of oil China imports.
Beyond cost and infrastructure, capacity constraints remain a decisive factor. The total amount of energy flowing through pipelines or overland routes is limited, and even with all alternative routes operating at full capacity, they could not replace the roughly 17 to 20 million barrels of oil per day that currently pass through the Strait of Hormuz. For a country like China, whose energy needs are growing alongside industrial and transportation demands, these constraints make alternative routes insufficient to meet both short-term and long-term requirements.
Political considerations also influence the viability of alternative routes. Land-based pipelines crossing multiple countries are subject to bilateral and multilateral agreements, political stability, and regional conflicts, which can create uncertainties that are difficult to manage. Maritime routes, despite security risks, are supported by a combination of international conventions, naval patrols, and global shipping protocols, which provide a level of predictability and flexibility that overland alternatives cannot easily match.
In addition, time efficiency is a key factor for energy logistics. Tankers traveling through the Strait of Hormuz reach Asian markets faster than oil transported via longer pipelines or complicated overland networks, allowing China to respond more rapidly to changes in demand or market conditions. Speed and reliability are therefore critical advantages of the maritime route, making it difficult to replace with slower, more complex alternatives without impacting energy security.
Even the possibility of expanding existing pipelines has limits. Increasing capacity requires significant financial investment, technical expertise, and environmental approvals, all of which take years to implement. In contrast, the Strait of Hormuz is already equipped to handle massive tanker traffic and provides an immediate, proven route for delivering oil to China efficiently and reliably.
China's reliance on Hormuz is also reinforced by its broader maritime trade strategy. Ships carrying oil often return with Chinese exports to the Middle East, creating a continuous flow that maximizes the efficiency of shipping operations. Alternative routes that cannot accommodate round-trip logistics at the same scale would reduce efficiency, increase costs, and disrupt the synchronized nature of China's global shipping network.
Considering all of these factors, limited alternative capacity, higher transportation costs, infrastructure challenges, political uncertainties, and economic efficiency, it becomes evident why China continues to rely on the Strait of Hormuz as its primary maritime energy corridor. Despite the occasional security risks, the strait remains the most practical, reliable, and economically viable route to sustain China's energy imports.
In conclusion, while pipelines and overland routes exist as supplementary options, they are insufficient to replace the volume, efficiency, and reliability of maritime transport through Hormuz. For now, the strait remains the backbone of China's energy supply chain, a critical artery that supports industrial growth, economic stability, and the broader trade networks that connect China to the Middle East and the world.
As we move into understanding the broader impact of China's maritime operations, it becomes clear that Chinese shipping through the Strait of Hormuz has far-reaching implications for global energy markets, international politics, and the balance of power in the Middle East. China is no longer just a regional consumer of energy. It is a dominant player in the global energy landscape, importing millions of barrels of oil per day from Gulf producers. Its reliance on Hormuz highlights how interconnected global economies are, because disruptions in this relatively narrow waterway could ripple across continents, affecting energy availability, industrial production, and even the stability of financial markets worldwide.
That's a crucial point, Adam, because when Chinese tankers continue operating in Hormuz, it signals a measure of confidence in the region's stability, even amid periodic geopolitical tensions. This consistent flow of energy supplies contributes directly to the relative stability of oil prices globally. When major consumers like China maintain their imports, sudden spikes or drops in crude prices are often moderated, providing predictable conditions for businesses, governments, and investors who depend on energy for industrial production, transportation, and domestic consumption.
Exactly, Julia. Beyond pricing, the presence of Chinese shipping in Hormuz underscores the importance of energy security for nations around the world. The Middle East remains a central hub for global oil exports, and the Strait of Hormuz serves as a choke point that could influence supply chains in Europe, Asia, and North America. By continuing its maritime operations, China demonstrates not only a commitment to securing its own energy needs, but also the broader reality that global commerce is intricately dependent on the uninterrupted flow of resources through strategic waterways.
In addition to energy security, there are important implications for maritime security as well. China's continued shipping presence requires coordination, awareness of naval patrols, and adherence to international shipping norms. This reinforces the role of international coalitions and regional security measures in protecting commercial traffic. In a sense, China's participation in this high-traffic corridor indirectly supports global maritime stability by normalizing continuous commercial activity despite tensions or potential threats in the Gulf.
And when we consider global supply chains, the Strait of Hormuz becomes more than just an energy passage. It is a critical artery for industries worldwide. Oil transported through Hormuz fuels manufacturing plants, electricity generation, and transportation networks across Asia and beyond. Disruptions in this waterway would therefore not just affect China, Saudi Arabia, or Iran. The consequences would cascade into Europe, Africa, and the Americas, showing how a single strategic choke point can influence the entire interconnected global economy.
Another dimension to consider is the balance of power in the Middle East. China's presence in Hormuz illustrates a subtle shift in influence. While Western countries, particularly the United States, have traditionally played a dominant role in Gulf security, China's commercial engagement allows it to exert soft power through economic leverage rather than military intervention. By remaining a major trading partner for multiple Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE, China positions itself as a stabilizing economic actor whose interests align with keeping the maritime routes open and regional trade flowing.
That balance of power is essential to understanding the modern geopolitical environment. Countries in the Gulf region benefit from diversified partnerships that reduce reliance on a single global power, while China gains energy security and influence without direct military involvement. This careful approach to diplomacy and trade demonstrates how strategic economics and maritime operations are intertwined with global political dynamics, particularly in regions critical for energy exports.
Another key reflection is the role of energy and maritime security in shaping international alliances. Countries that rely on Gulf oil must maintain stable relations with both energy producers and major consumers like China. The interdependence created by this dynamic illustrates how modern global trade requires careful coordination, not just among governments, but also between shipping companies, port authorities, and international organizations tasked with safeguarding maritime traffic.
When analyzing these factors collectively, it becomes evident that China's shipping operations are more than routine commercial activity. They are a demonstration of how global trade, energy security, and diplomacy intersect in practice. Every tanker that passes through the Strait of Hormuz reflects a carefully balanced system of economics, politics, and logistics that underpins the modern global economy.
In conclusion, China's continued presence in the Strait of Hormuz serves as a reminder that strategic waterways are not just geographic features. They are lifelines of global commerce. Energy security, maritime stability, and international economic cooperation all depend on the uninterrupted flow of trade through these critical passages. By maintaining its shipping operations, China underscores the reality that the modern world economy is deeply interconnected and reliant on the safe passage of energy and goods through strategic choke points like Hormuz.
Indeed, Julia. The Strait of Hormuz exemplifies how a single waterway can influence markets, geopolitics, and global supply chains. China's role in maintaining steady shipping here reflects both its growing importance in energy markets and the broader lesson that global trade and economic stability are inseparable from strategic geography and diplomatic foresight.
Ultimately, the lesson for our listeners is clear. Strategic waterways like the Strait of Hormuz matter far beyond the borders of the countries immediately surrounding them. China's continued operations highlight how deeply global trade depends on these passages, demonstrating that energy security, diplomatic balance, and maritime operations are all crucial components of today's interconnected world.
As we reach the conclusion of today's podcast, it's time to reflect on the critical lessons we've learned about the Strait of Hormuz and its global significance. This narrow waterway, only about 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, is one of the most important energy routes in the world. Nearly 1/5 of the world's oil passes through it every single day, making it an essential artery for the global economy. For countries like China, which rely heavily on energy imports from the Middle East, Hormuz is not just a shipping lane, it is a lifeline, connecting their industrial hubs and ports with oil-producing regions thousands of kilometers away. Its geography and established infrastructure make it extremely difficult to replace with alternative routes, whether pipelines or overland corridors, meaning that global trade remains closely tied to this strategic choke point.
Exactly, Adam. When we consider the wider implications, it's clear that global trade continues even during periods of political tension, because economies are deeply dependent on stability and the reliable flow of energy. Countries cannot simply halt imports or switch routes overnight, especially at the scale required to meet industrial and transportation demands. This is why Chinese ships, along with vessels from other nations, continue to navigate the Strait of Hormuz, despite regional disputes, naval patrols, and occasional security threats. Maintaining uninterrupted commerce has become a priority not only for individual countries, but for the stability of global markets as a whole.
Another important takeaway is how geography and economics intersect in ways that shape international policy. The location of the Strait of Hormuz between Iran and Oman, combined with its role as a gateway from the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean, makes it a strategic choke point. Energy flows through this narrow corridor because it is the most direct and efficient route from major Middle Eastern producers to Asian and global markets. While pipelines and overland alternatives exist, their capacity and efficiency cannot match the volume transported by tankers, demonstrating how geography often dictates economic and strategic decisions.
This also underscores the importance of China's diplomatic strategy in the region. By maintaining balanced relations with countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, and Qatar, China protects its shipping and energy interests without direct military involvement. Economic diplomacy ensures that trade flows remain uninterrupted, illustrating how commercial priorities can shape international relations. In a way, every vessel that passes safely through Hormuz reflects decades of careful planning, cooperation, and negotiation that support the global energy network.
For listeners who are curious about the bigger picture, the Strait of Hormuz is a perfect example of how energy, geography, and politics are interconnected. Even a small disruption here, a temporary closure, an attack, or a spike in regional tension, can create ripple effects felt worldwide. Oil prices can spike, supply chains can be stressed, and governments may need to adjust policies to maintain stability. This demonstrates why energy security is always more than just a national concern. It is a global imperative.
Exactly, Adam. Global trade and energy transport are resilient, but they are also highly sensitive to strategic choke points. The continued movement of Chinese tankers and other international vessels shows that economic priorities often outweigh short-term political disputes. Markets, governments, and industries all rely on predictable supply flows, and strategic waterways like Hormuz are central to sustaining that predictability. Understanding this helps us appreciate how intertwined the modern economy really is with geography and energy logistics.
It is also important for listeners to realize that the Strait of Hormuz is not just about oil. It symbolizes the broader dynamics of global power. Control, access, and security of strategic energy routes influence alliances, regional diplomacy, and international economic policy. Countries with interests in the Gulf and beyond must constantly balance economic needs with geopolitical realities, which is why naval patrols, international agreements, and diplomatic efforts coexist alongside commercial shipping operations in this corridor.
Another reflection is that this reliance on key energy routes persists even in an era where renewable energy and alternative technologies are gaining attention. While solar, wind, and electric power are growing sectors, oil remains a dominant fuel for transportation, industry, and global trade. The reality is that strategic waterways like Hormuz will continue to influence energy security, economic stability, and international relations for decades to come.
So, dear listeners, the key lesson here is that understanding places like the Strait of Hormuz provides insight into how geography, economics, and international politics shape the modern world. By studying the movement of energy through this narrow corridor, we can see how strategic planning, diplomacy, and global trade intersect, creating a delicate balance that affects everyone from producers to consumers around the world.
And as we reflect on this, it is clear that even with advances in technology and alternative energy sources, the movement of oil through narrow waterways still plays a major role in global stability. The Strait of Hormuz reminds us that physical geography, international cooperation, and energy strategy remain fundamental to the functioning of the global economy.
For anyone interested in global affairs, economics, or international trade, observing these energy routes provides a window into the complex forces that govern the modern world. The decisions made by nations, companies, and international actors around these strategic waterways have consequences that reach far beyond the Gulf itself, influencing markets, politics, and even everyday life across the globe.
Finally, we want our listeners to think critically about the interconnected nature of our world. Strategic choke points, energy flows, and diplomacy are not abstract concepts. They are living, dynamic systems that affect global stability, trade, and security. By following developments in places like the Strait of Hormuz, we gain a better understanding of how energy and geography shape international relations.
Thank you for joining us today on the English Globe. We hope this discussion has helped you see the importance of strategic energy routes and their global implications, and we encourage you to reflect on how geography, energy, and diplomacy continue to influence the world around us.
Yes, Adam. And to our dear listeners, remember to like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and let us know in the comments where you are listening from and what you think about the role of the Strait of Hormuz in global trade and energy security. Your opinions make our discussion richer and more insightful.
Until next time, keep observing the world carefully, stay curious about global affairs, and understand that even the smallest geographic choke points can have a massive impact on the way the world functions. The Strait of Hormuz is a perfect example of that reality, connecting energy, trade, and international power in ways that shape our modern lives.
Thank you, dear listeners. Stay safe, stay informed, and keep learning. The world is vast, but understanding its strategic roots helps us see the bigger picture of global interdependence and stability.